Okay, Libby, we're live right now. Let me start
Great.
with an introduction.
Okay. If I see your face, that's awesome. If you can do that, if you're able to turn on your camera.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Thanks.
Okay, this is an introduction to Libby Copeland. She's an award-winning journalist, an author who writes for New York about culture and science. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Smithsonian Magazine. Her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, is published by Abrams in 2020, explores the rapidly evolving phenomena of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, before you spit in that vial, read this book. The Washington Post says The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, or both? It was recently named the Guardian's list of the best books of 2020.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Okay. And let's see. There's a story of Alice Collins' Clue Book. I hope I'm saying that right. It frames your book. Without spoiling the story, could you explain why her singular quest provides such a powerful window into home DNA testing?
Sure. Yeah. And I'll back up and explain a little of how I came to write the book. So I write about science and culture, and I'm particularly interested in how technology shapes us in ways that we sometimes don't expect. And so about 4 years ago, I was in conversation with my editor at the Washington Post. And we were talking about home DNA testing, which at the time was not as big as it is now, but it was certainly becoming a really popular consumer item. It was the sort of thing people bought for each other at Christmas. Talking about DNA testing from companies like Ancestry and 23andMe and MyHeritage, which, have become this kind of, recreational item that a lot of people buy. And there's close to 40 million DNA test kits that have been sold at this point. But 4 years ago, there were just 8 million. And yet we were starting to hear stories bubble up about a segment of people who were taking these tests and were getting kind of more than they expected, right? They were kind of going into it with fairly low expectations or just kind of casual curiosity about finding out a little bit more about their ancestral heritage, maybe finding like a long lost second cousin. And they were getting news that was different than they expected, that was much more profound, much more of a big deal. They were discovering, for instance, that they weren't genetically related to their father, right? And that there was this kind of family secret that maybe went back many decades and had ramifications for how they thought about their parents. Or they were discovering that they, one of their parents had had a relationship before they were married, and they had a long lost, much older sister. And they were, kind of rocked by this, rocked to the core. So we decided to write about the kind of unintended consequences of a technology, an astonishing technology that can do so much, that can kind of bring the past forward to the present, that can put us in touch with our roots, and that sometimes, lays these surprises at our door. So I wrote about it for the Washington Post, and the piece went viral. And what happened is I started getting emails from people here in the US, but also abroad, by the hundreds, like handfuls and handfuls of emails from people who had done DNA testing, maybe in the early days, maybe like 2 months before I wrote my story, right? And they were wanting to tell me about how it had radically changed their life. It had changed the way they looked at themselves, changed the way they thought about their families and their culture and the past and their relationship with the truth. It was like a really huge, big deal for a lot of people. And as I was talking to people, I was kind of blown away by this. And I felt like this is seismic cultural moment. We're going to look back and we're going to say, wow, that's the moment that everything changed. It was a moment of intergenerational reckoning, right? A moment when parents realized they needed to talk differently to their children about how they'd come into the world. They needed to tell them the truth. And there's all these people kind of struggling with the fallout. So I decided to write a book. That book became The Lost Family. And the book is structured around a central narrative. And that's the story of the person you mentioned, Alice Collins Playbook, who is this fascinating woman. She's a retiree when we first meet her. She is incredibly sharp and intelligent and comfortable with technology. And she takes a DNA test back in 2012, which is not the very beginning of the industry, but in many ways the dawn of the industry as we know it, because a new kind of DNA testing had recently come on the scene by the time she took a test. And it kind of transformed the way the industry worked, and it gave people access to a lot more information. So Alice takes this test in 2012, and she's a genealogist who is just really interested in finding out a little bit more. She knows who she is, she knows who her parents are, she knows her roots, she knows she's Irish American, like through and through, with a little British Isles thrown in, Brits and Scots, but primarily Irish. She's got grandparents who were Irish immigrants. She's got a really strong sense of that ethnic identity, having grown up with it. And she's just trying to figure out like what county in Ireland she can trace back to. So she takes this test and she gets these results that don't make sense to her given everything she knows. Basically, Ancestry, which is one of the big companies and the company she tests through, tells her that she's half Ashkenazi Jewish, which is Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And when scientists are looking to tell us where we come from 500 to 1,000 years ago, they were looking at certain genetic markers, and people who have roots in, the Ashkenazi Jewish community, they have different markers than people whose ancestry come from Ireland. So they can pick that out. But Alice is thinking, well, this company just messed up. They don't actually know what they're doing yet. They're just new on the scene, and they probably can't parse the data yet. So being very data minded, she decides to take a test at another company, 23andMe. And of course, what happens, you can probably already see it coming, is that 23andMe results are the same. And then she has kind of this moment of like, well, what does this mean? Well, how can this be? And her first thought is, you know what? I'm probably not related to my dad, right? This probably means that my mom had a relationship outside the marriage, and my father is some stranger, and all my 6 siblings have the same dad and I have a different dad. And this is kind of like a heartbreaking thing for her to face, but it turns out not to be true. And what's interesting about this is that for most people, a major surprise like this, the revelation that they're not genetically related to dad is going to be the explanation. If they're getting a result of this kind and they're half unexpected ancestry and they can go back and actually vet that and they can be sure about it, that is often the explanation. And that is one of the most common kinds of DNA surprises. There's that for that minority of people who are getting surprises, a lot of them are finding out they're not genetically related to dad for one reason or another. And so Alice investigates that because it seems the most likely scenario, but then she is able to disprove it. And she launches on this lengthy investigation, which basically becomes, I would describe it as like an existential mystery, right? It's a mystery in the sense that it's like it's kind of like a thriller. But the question isn't like who done it or who killed who. The question is like, who am I? So it's a bit like, I wanted the book to read a bit like fiction in sense of the pacing, but I wanted it to, but of course it's true, right? And the journey is a kind of an inward one as well as one of history. So Alice investigates every other theory she can think of to explain this. One is that she could be donor conceived, right? So that maybe her dad isn't the man she thought of, but for a different reason, and that her mom used a sperm donor to conceive her. That's not the case. She investigates the possibility that she's adopted. That's not it. And the last theory that she investigates is the possibility that her family came from a group of people who hid their Jewish identity in an attempt to assimilate and maybe converted and pretended to be something else. And that does exist. And there are people making those discoveries through DNA, but that was not the explanation in Alice's case. And in fact, her explanation winds up, I won't say what it is, but the actual truth of her story takes her 2.5 years to solve, and it winds up going back 100 years. And it's this really stunning kind of thing, and it's very surprising. But the reason I like the idea of using her story as that narrative, even though her situation is so unusual that many people would say, well, I'm sure that's not what happened to me, is that she, as a narrative device, every time she kind of investigates one theory, she kind of is able to then veer off. And I veer off as the writer, and I'm able to tell you about what does it look like to discover your dad's not genetically related to you. It's a phenomenon known as a non-paternity event, or not parent expected. Some people call it misattributed parentage experience. There's a lot of acronyms for it. The reason there's so many acronyms is because it's really common. It's really common, and it's important that we actually talk about it and we normalize it, because it is so common, and a lot of people feel a great deal of shame and embarrassment about that, right? And I also tell other stories. I tell the story of a woman who was a late discovery adoptee. And how did she find out that she was adopted at age 51? She found out through a DNA test. Her adopted mother, did not tell her. It's a very complex story, and it's a beautiful story, and it's kind of a heartbreaking story, and I tell that. And I tell stories of donor-conceived families with many, many siblings and how they negotiate and navigate that, right? A donor father who takes a DNA test, not really even realizing what it's going to reveal, and then finding that he has, 22 donor children, and how does he navigate that? And so using Alice allows me to tell a lot of American stories. Some of them are actually people who had emailed me after that first Washington Post article came out. So Alice is the kind of vehicle to get us through the story of America in this moment.
Very good. Very good. Sounds very interesting. Let me, I have a question. I'm not going to read the next one here. I can imagine, I have family that are African American, and I can imagine that this would be particularly difficult for a lot of African Americans in this country to trace their history, or to actually get some history.
Yeah.
What does DNA testing, what can it do for someone like, we know the story of Thomas Jefferson and his ancestors from his relationship with, one of his slaves.
Sally,
Is it helpful? Could they actually,
Yes.
Can you actually trace back your African American history to a specific spot in Africa and stuff like that? Does DNA testing help you with that?
It's remarkably helpful, and it's also often painful, right? Anytime you're looking at American history, particularly for certain groups, seeing the evidence right in front of you, written in black and white, so to speak, right, in the scientific evidence, can be really tough, but it's important. And it's actually really important, I think, for white Americans to also, acknowledge the complications and the cruelties of the past. And I think DNA is allowing for that too. So I'll talk a little bit about this. So genealogy is hard. Genealogy is especially hard for marginalized groups in general, just like as a blanket statement, right? Whether you're talking about people who were adopted, who were denied their birth certificates in their state, they're not actually allowed to see their original birth certificates. They don't actually have access to the identities of their birth parents. Or if you're talking about groups that were historically brutalized, terrorized, taken over in chains. And so for the African American community, there's a saying that history is written by the winners, right? You have to be considered important enough to be written about in order to find a genealogical record for yourself. And you have to have been literate enough to keep a diary in order for your, descendants to look that up and find traces of, what your life was like, right? So if you are researching your enslaved ancestors, let's say you're following a great grandmother through the federal census, and you want to find out where she was before 1870. So you want to find out where she was living during the time of slavery. Like you've got her, in Mississippi in 1870, and then you're like, but where was she before that? Poof, she disappears. And the reason she disappears is because she wasn't named in the federal census when she was enslaved. She was a tick mark in a box. How do you trace her? And I mean, there's so many other reasons why it's difficult to trace enslaved ancestors, including the fact that families were routinely split up. So you can't count on somebody being in a particular place or being necessarily near their child, right? So these things make it really difficult to use traditional genealogical records to follow your ancestors. And I mean, there are some records, but it's just not as easy. And so DNA can be an enormous kind of opportunity to make an end run around the lack of records, because when you take a DNA test through one of these major companies, you're getting two pieces of information through this test. And this is called autosomal DNA testing. And autosomal DNA is DNA that you inherit from both your parents. And it's going to tell you your kind of immediate relatives on your maternal and paternal sides. Those are people who took a DNA test with the same company, and they show up as related to you in the database because you and they share overlapping genetic segments, and the company can see that. And they can see from the number and the length of those segments how closely related you are, right? Mm-hmm. Are you a third to fifth cousin, or are you like a half sister or a parent child? And the other piece of information, and that, by the way, is very reliable, especially for close relationships. They can't always tell you the exact nature of the relationship, but they can tell you that you're closely related, right? And so connecting with someone who seems to be a first cousin once removed, according to the DNA data, means that then you can compare with them. You can say to them, hey, like, I'm so-and-so, and these are my surnames, and here's my tree. And can you tell me a little about yourself? And if they're willing to share that data, they may have pieces that you don't have, right? And if they're a distant cousin, that may mean that you trace pretty far back to understand your most recent common ancestor. And so that work, I mean, it's not like DNA gives you all the answers in one fell swoop at all, right? You still have to do the genealogical research, but that work of kind of crowdsourcing and getting together with distant relatives and hooking up and exchanging information, that definitely can get you, pretty far back in terms of tracing and understanding where you come from. The other piece of information that you're getting is your ethnicity estimate, and that's purporting to be able to tell you where you come from anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years ago. And that is imperfect. It's pretty good, but it's not perfect. It's not perfect sometimes because some populations aren't as sampled in the database. And it's not perfect because some populations look really similar to other populations, and the companies can't always pick out with such precise granularity the distinction between someone with German roots and someone with French roots. So Africa is traditionally within this space undersampled, meaning that if you take a test, you may get like a really wide range of where your people are coming from, like Western Africa, which is helpful, but not that helpful, right? And European Americans can generally count on their results being much better in terms of like, oh, it's like, this particular region of present day Germany. Wow, that's absolutely amazing. Like, I was able to get the exact county in Sweden that my great grandmother came from, the exact county, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of remarkable, but that's not happening for everyone. However, there is some incredible stuff, right? So I write in the book about one man. He is an African-American genealogist, and what he does is he does a combination of that ethnicity estimate coupled with finding cousins. And the magic of it is that he actually finds some cousins who tested from as they live in Africa. Their ancestors were not enslaved, so they stayed, and they actually tested there. And he is able to detect that they're related to him distantly and connect up with them and understand how he's related to them. Mm-hmm. And because he does that, in that he doesn't have such a huge area, he has like a much more tight area to understand where some of his lines come from. And then he converses with one distant cousin in Africa who tells him, listen, it's not just that our people are from this general region of this country. Our people are the Fulani. Okay, what's that? He goes and looks it up. It's a community of people. It's a community of people that he can read about. He can read about their language, their customs, their food, their practices, where they were living historically. It's the most incredible gift. So to be able to actually understand precisely where that one ancestor came from before the transatlantic slave trade, that is not in every case, right? That's not going to happen for everyone, but it is an incredible gift that DNA does sometimes make possible. There's another story in the book that I tell about an African-American genealogist who's able to confirm oral history in the family. And the oral history is that they are descended from an enslaved woman and her white enslaver. And that's a story that they've told over and over again, that's been passed down, that they then, but they haven't seen the actual evidence in the DNA. And when they do the DNA, they are able then to confirm the story, combining that with historical records, and to hook up with a white cousin who is descended from that white man and doesn't know about this story. And that's kind of circling back to what I was saying earlier, which is that this is like an opportunity not just for African Americans to learn their history, it's also an opportunity for white Americans whose ancestors might have been, not the people that we're proudest of in our ancestral line, right? But to kind of grapple with it, because we sometimes act as if we are apart from it, and we're not. If your people have deep roots in the US and they lived in the South, you may find some stuff. And that stuff may be painful, but it is the reality of our history. And it's important that we all kind of grapple with that. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about that in March. And if I find it during this chat, I'll throw it in. Although everyone's on Facebook Live, so no one will see it. But anyway, you can look it up. And I wrote about how DNA testing may be making possible a kind of helping us with our kind of modern day reckoning in America with racial issues and the truth about the past.
Very good, thank you. Let me see. Okay, there's a question here I'm kind of curious about. It says, with more than 37 million people who haven't taken a home DNA test, and it says the majority of them are American. You say that America has reached a tipping point. What are the implications?
Yeah, what are the implications of that? So 37, actually probably close to 40 million people now, most of them Americans. That is a subset. Obviously, it's not the majority of the US population, but as a result, it means that the majority of the US population is potentially affected and potentially identifiable through DNA testing. Why? Because we share these overlapping genetic segments, and people are potentially identifiable from a third cousin match or closer, sometimes even more distant. So what does that mean? It means that if you're a man who helped conceive a child in 1975 when you were in high school, and you didn't even know it, and you've never taken a DNA test, you may still be found by that child if that child is looking for you. Because if somebody is looking for you and related to you, they can piece together your identity, potentially through second, third cousin matches. And the databases are so big at this point that, in fact, people are routinely getting much closer hits. So for me to go back and trace how, like, let's say I'm looking for my genetic father. Let's say I'm donor conceived, right? And I'm looking for the man who contributed, the stranger who contributed half my genetic material, because I want to understand myself. I want to understand my roots. I want to know my medical history. I want that gift of identity that knowing who my genetic father is can give me. And I want to know if I have siblings, right? Even though my donor, who was promised anonymity in 1975, right, even though he is not in the system, I test and I very rapidly find a first cousin or a second cousin, right? Or maybe even one of my donor siblings is in there and they're listed as a half sibling. From that, it is extremely easy to figure out his identity. It requires a little genealogical research, but the closer the match, the easier it is. And then I have to make a decision, right? Do I reach out to him? I might want to do some sleuthing and see what I can find out about him. Maybe I know it's one of two brothers and I'm trying to figure out which one it is, and I'm looking them up and I see one was a medical student at Penn in 1975. It's probably him, right? And then, maybe 5 of us get together and decide to write him a letter. So this is the kind of moment that we're in. I know it seems like, gosh, can that really be happening on such a scale? It is happening all over right now, all over America on a massive scale. This is like happening, Hundreds of thousands of people have discovered they're not genetically related to their dad. Many, many more have discovered some other scenario, like that they were adopted and they weren't told, or they have a previously unknown half sibling. And then each revelation reverberates across an entire family, right? So if I find out through a test that I'm not genetically related to dad, that has implications for me, of course, but it also has implications for him and my mom and their relationship, right? That could be very, very painful for them to have a conversation if he doesn't know. Or in the case of a donor conception, he would know. But it has implications then for the siblings that I'm now discovering are my half siblings, genetically speaking. And then there is somebody, I've never even heard his name before, and he lives 2 states away, and I'm discovering that he's my genetic father and potentially reaching out to him. And now that has implications for him and his spouse and their children, who are now my newfound half siblings who I may want to have relationships with and kind of make up for lost time. So each revelation kind of reverberates across 8 to 10 people. So you're talking about millions of Americans right now kind of grappling with this. So the tipping point means that parents have to talk differently to their children about how they came into the world, because there's no such thing as a family secret anymore. In terms of genetic secrets, there's increasingly in the future not going to be a time when a child doesn't know the truth about their genetic origins. And that means that people who are in possession of secrets about their children for very understandable reasons, historical reasons about taboos and social ostracization and stigmas and all that stuff, right, are nevertheless, they're going to have to figure out how to tell their children or contextualize it if their children are coming to them and saying, hey, I just got this news. We're going to have to start talking about this, because it's just a matter of time, not if, but when people who don't know the truth about their genetic origins are going to discover them. And you don't even need to necessarily take a DNA test in order to find out information about yourself, your family, your health history that materially affects you. So that's sort of the urgency of getting in front of this moment.
I got a personal question here that related to something I know about him. What are are there any legal restrictions, like if a father is looking for a child and the child does not want to know his father, or vice versa?
That's a good
Father's looking for a child and maybe he gave that child up for adoption. Are there rules saying that if the government has information and they know that the child is around, does the father have a legal right to just try to get in touch with them, and the child may say no, or he may not have the right whatsoever to actually try to get in touch with the child?
There's no law in this area as far as finding out information about someone that you're related to, genetically speaking, and then deciding to contact them or not contact them. Now, if you are let's say you're talking about a donor conceived child, the fertility bank may have rules that your mother agreed to, let's say, that binds her contractually from revealing certain things, and depends I don't know what their penalty could be. Like, it depends on the circumstances, right? But the child didn't agree to that contract. And as far as like adoption agencies go, adoption agencies may have things that they decline to want to give, right? They may, a child, this is, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of the adult child, because that is usually the stories that you're hearing, is those adult children seeking information and not being able to get it through the adoption agency. But there's no law that says that if you first of all, DNA testing is an end run around all that. It doesn't matter what the fertility bank says. It doesn't matter what the adoption agency says. There's nobody who can tell you, if you go ahead and take a test and you're able to understand who your genetic child's identity, there's ethics, there's morality, there's politeness and convention, but there's no law. Mm-hmm. So the kind of working rubric that I've heard a lot is, the working framework is, you can decline to have a relationship with someone, but you don't have the power to know that they do or don't exist, right? Like they have the right to contact you. You have the right to not write back.
Right.
And it's a complicated world because, sometimes men don't want to know their children. I haven't heard of a lot of cases of men wanting to know their children and their children not wanting to know them. But I have heard cases of children wanting to know their fathers, and their fathers sometimes deleting their kits, walking away, ceasing to have contact. Or in one case that I write about in the book, a man had his lawyer send a letter to his genetic daughter saying, we request a discontinuance of contact. Please stop contacting my client. We don't believe that you're genetically related. But on Ancestry, they're listed as parent-child. There's very few errors, right? This is not something where they're swapping vials. This guy's her dad. And it's not the greatest introduction to a good relationship on either end, right? Like, I'm sure sometimes the children fumble, sometimes the adults fumble. Like, there's no guidebook for any of this. There's no, that's the craziest thing, is that everyone is their own bioethicist. Everyone has to make their own decisions. Everyone has to figure this out on their own, and there's no real guidebook.
One of the things that I've thought about before is, the position of a father or a mother who isn't there and hasn't raised the child. And, I feel like it's not really, even though it's genetically the father really isn't the father. You
Right.
may have a father that was a stepfather that was very good to the child.
Right.
And isn't genetically related. And I would think most children in that situation would recognize their stepfather as their father, even though genetically they're related to another man. So it's interesting to me because I've come from a very big family. I've got 10 brothers and sisters, and each of us have our own little story to tell. And, you ponder things like that. Sometimes I know people who have had children when they were very young, like you said, in high school, and never were involved in their lives, feel like they're not really the father, and they don't feel the closeness you typically have towards someone that you spend your life with.
So,
I don't know,
I think that's the question you're asking is actually the question. In many ways, it is the question, right? In many ways, it's the question that I turn over again and again in the book. And it's fitting that you're asking this with just Father's Day having passed, because there is this question of what is a father, right? Like, who is my father? What is a father?
And is it important that, I keep in contact with my genetic father, even though we had no relationship?
This is a decision everyone has to make for themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the people that I was interviewing, they were seekers. They wanted to know.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they didn't always want relationships, but they wanted to know more because they saw that question of who is my genetic father as a piece of the puzzle to explain things that didn't make sense before, as a part of their reckoning. That doesn't mean that they saw that man as a replacement for dad. Dad is dad. If you have a loving relationship with dad, that is, he's the guy. He's the guy who tucked you in at night. He's the guy who raised you. He taught you to play baseball. Like, that is the guy. He was there. He showed up, right? And there's a woman named Lori. I tell her story in the book, and she says, like, I can't imagine ever calling anyone else dad, right? He's the guy who did the job. But when he passes away, she wants to know her genetic father, not because she wants to have a dad again. And the reason she waits is not that she wants a man to replace her dad. It's that out of respect to her dad, she would never want him to know. And because he's living, she kind of feels a sense of loyalty. But when he passes away, she gives herself permission to investigate her biological father. And she never winds up having a relationship with one. He doesn't want one. But that's not necessarily what she is seeking. She's seeking her own identity, her roots, right? She's a genealogist. And a lot of people are into genealogy right now, and they have this sense that the past informs the present, right? But, part of this is a problem of language. What do you call the man who contributed half your genetic material when you already have a dad? And what kind of relationships can you have with him? And I think we tend to think in kind of binary terms that, you can only have one father. So what is this other guy? And what the seekers have taught me is that we may not have the language for it, but you can have room for both in terms of in your heart, if that's what's, if you can have a relationship and that's what's intended and he wants that too, and you can have some sort of relationship, you can have room in your heart for both people, both dad and this dude who contributed half your genetic material, whatever you want to call him. You call him by his first name, you call him, I don't know what, right? People actually attempt to answer that question in the book, right? Like, and we like kind of talk about that. Or, you don't have a relationship with him, but he is still central potentially to your own identity. And to understanding why certain things happen in your childhood, to understanding things that your mom said, to understanding a feeling of otherness that you felt always a little bit different than your family, right? So it kind of answers questions. And yet, of course, it is not a black and white thing. It is not as if he replaces dad. And that's that nuance. That is basically the thing I talk about more than anything else, right? Because we have to open ourselves up to that nuance if we're going to survive in this new era where you can cheaply and quickly and easily discover your genetic heritage. And sometimes it's not what you thought. We have to live in that kind of, we have to allow for that kind of emotional nuance. And most people that I've talked to, they are living that. They're not binary in their thinking. They're not black and white. They are very much living that nuance.
Okay, very good. It's fascinating to consider the implications for those who have not been tested. Would you say more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I talked about the tipping point, right? This idea that potentially people are identifiable, even if they're not in the system. And I think, that means that we're kind of moving toward an era when, parents talk differently to their children from a very early age. We've already moved towards open adoptions and open disclosure of adoptions, and parents are much more likely to tell their children that they're donor conceived than they were in the past. I believe that's, I'm not sure on the data, I haven't looked at it in a while, but I believe that is the majority of donor conceived children's experiences that they're told in childhood, and that was not the case decades ago. So we've kind of already moved in that direction, and there's more of a growing acknowledgement of this sense that your genetic origins can be really important to understanding who you are. There's even a growing advocacy movement around the right to know your own genetic origins, this idea that it's a basic human right to know this, and that already existed, but the DNA age has kind of like helped that to grow.
Good.
Can I ask you a question? Are we taking questions on Facebook?
The questions, yeah, but I don't believe there's anybody hooked up right now.
Okay.
Most of the people at the library here usually go back and look for
And
things
watch
on
it. Okay.
Facebook. So
if there's anyone watching, feel free to throw a question in.
Exactly.
You'll probably see this later. I can talk a little bit about the history of the industry if that's of interest to you, because it's kind of a funny story how this whole world got started.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mentioned earlier that there was this kind of turning point back in 2012 when Alice tested about 10 or so years ago, where autosomal DNA came on the scene. But the industry is actually older than that. It's actually 21 years old. And it started with a different kind of DNA. And the story of how it started is kind of great because there's a kind of a truth about technology, which is that we never constantly unforeseen consequences, right? We can never quite predict where it's going. Like it's true for Twitter, it's true for Facebook. Like I used to be a tech reporter at the Washington Post, and I look back at a story I'd written in 2004 about the Facebook, as it was called then. It was just in college communities. It was vastly different than it is now. And I'm looking at this story. I'm like, oh my gosh, I had no idea where this was going, right? I had no idea what it was going to look like. I had no idea how it was going to be like this part of my life that's like woven into my life at this point in time. So this is DNA testing is no exception to this rule that that we don't know where it's going. And so if you look back, there was a company down in Houston, Texas called Family Tree DNA. They're one of the big four. There's four major DNA testing companies: Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA. And Family Tree DNA is the smallest and the oldest of the major companies. And they all have at least 1 million in their database. Some of them, Ancestry has 20 million people in their database. So some of them are much larger than others. But Family Tree DNA started out as the brainchild of a man named Bennett Greenspan, who was a genealogist and a sort of serial entrepreneur who was on a break in the late 90s from his company. He had like just sold a company that he had had. And he was kind of like in between pictures, as they like to say. He was not sure what he was doing next. And his wife basically got like annoyed with him for being constantly underfoot and said, like, please get yourself a hobby, right? And he was a genealogist, a lifelong genealogist, but it had been a while because he would dip into genealogy and then he would get frustrated. He would hit a brick wall, which is a term that genealogists use when they, get to a point where they can't figure something out. They can't figure out their fourth great grandmother and they get stuck. And so he kind of, had abandoned something. He had abandoned his genealogy work sometime before. And so he goes back into it at his wife's urging. And he finds this cousin, potentially a cousin in Argentina. He thinks the guy's related to him from back in the old country in Europe, but he starts corresponding with this guy and they can't figure it out. They can't figure out if they're actually related to each other. They're sending documents back and forth. They're comparing surnames and hometowns, and they can't get anywhere. They can't prove it. So he has this insight. He realizes that DNA testing might be able to tell him. And he's particularly interested in the Y chromosome, which is what men pass down to their sons, and then the sons pass them down, and on down the line. And he's reading scientific papers about the study of Y DNA in certain populations. And he has this idea, and it's a very kind of Bennett Greenspan idea, to just look up the name of one of the scientists who's at the top of one of these papers, look him up like basically in the phone book, and call the guy up at his home on like a Sunday afternoon. So he calls up the scientist on a Sunday afternoon, and the guy's wife picks up the phone and puts him on, and he says, hey, gives him his spiel. My name's Bennett Greenspan, yada, yada. And I want to buy a DNA test kit from you. And the scientist is like, I'm not selling them. That's not the business I'm in. I do scientific research with them. I study human population genetics. And they're having this back and forth. And at one point, the scientist says, somebody ought to start a business, because I get enough calls from crazies like you who want a DNA test kit that maybe there's a market for it. And Greenspan, who needs very little urging to see an opportunity, goes bing, and he just decides he's going to be the guy who's going to start this company. And so he starts the company actually with the scientist in the beginning, and they're selling DNA test kits. And the DNA testing that they're doing is at the very beginning, Y DNA testing. So only men can take the test. And it's much less informative than the kind of testing that's available now. And it's much more expensive. So it's crude in terms of what it can tell you. It's expensive. It's a niche product. Guess who's interested in this? Not that many people are interested in this. Some very serious family history enthusiasts are interested in it and they flock to it, but it does not kind of achieve any kind of mainstream success. And Greenspan sees it in the beginning just as this niche product. And he doesn't have terribly high hopes for where it's going to go in terms of ever being, a mainstream consumer item. He told me a story about like just trying to sell the product and being so desperate to convince people this was going to help them that he would, kind of sweet talk them at conferences, and he would shake their hands, and then he would walk backwards and not let go as he walked them towards his booth, because he thought if he could just get them closer to his booth and closer to his product, he might be able to sell it. And then what changes is autosomal DNA. Autosomal DNA, which can give you your maternal and paternal relatives and give you that ethnicity estimate, that is the game changer that comes on the scene about a decade ago. And when Ancestry gets in on this world, they put a lot of money into advertising, especially in the last few years, especially 2016, 2017, hundreds of millions of dollars into advertising. And they developed this kind of iconic idea about the DNA test kit. This idea that you are embarking on a process of discovering your roots and reclaiming them, and that it's going to inform your present day identity to find out that you were actually from Sweden, right? You never knew it. And they're appealing to Americans who are basically rootless, children, grandchildren, great grandchildren of immigrants who maybe assimilated their way out of their ethnic identities, or just over time living here for many generations, they've lost their roots. And there's this idea of this kind of almost like archetypal homeland that you're going to gain access to, and this identity that you're going to gain access to. And it's like really, really appealing for lots of Americans. And this product that was so hard to sell becomes this gift you get, because you can't think of what else to get your father, right? And it's on sale. It's $60. Let's do it. Let's get it for Father's Day. And then, of course, some people suddenly discover that Father's Day means something radically different when they get the results of the test, right? But that is the sort of journey of this product. And, what Bennett told me is that he said in the very beginning, when he was still doing proof of concept, which is like where you test the thing to see if it works and how it works. So before he even put these kits on the market, he said he found a major surprise within one of his, for one of the folks that was doing the test with him. And so he knew as early as the late 90s that this was going to happen. And the companies started to hear from their customer service line representatives pretty quickly that there was a certain number of people who were calling up and saying, you guys messed up. This is saying that someone else is my father, but I know my father's this guy over here and I don't understand. Or this is saying I'm half Greek, but I know that I'm, 100% English. Or this is saying I have a genetic half sister, but I know I don't. You must have switched my vial. You switched it with my husband's. We sent them in together. And there's very, very few cases of that happening. The reality is that almost every time it is we who have our stories wrong for understandable reasons, right? Not the company that's messed up. So on the one hand, they knew early on a certain level that this was happening, right? Maybe not at the scale that it happens now, spread out across that many people. But they also didn't, on a certain level, kind of anticipate the very beginning that this would become a recreational product, that this was something you would buy just on a whim without quite necessarily imagining the consequences, and that there would be a significant minority of people who would then be seeking like mental health assistance because of the trauma of the discovery that they made, which is where we are now.
Very good. Okay, for the last question here, where do you think the DNA testing is going to be headed? Do you think it's going to continuously grow, or do you think maybe that we've maxed out and the people who want to do this testing are now all tested?
Well, I can tell you that the companies are hoping we haven't maxed out, right?
Sure.
But there's been a slowdown in sales over the last 18 months to 2 years. And that slowdown probably has to do with the fact that so many people have already tested, that you can't test in more than one place, right? When you can test in more than one place, but you can't test more than once. Well, I mean, you could, but there wouldn't be generally much point in testing, buying more kits, right, from the same company. And if you've tested in 2 places, you might be done. If you tested at 1 place, you might be done. And if you're not interested or can't afford it, then what is the appeal to you, right? Like you're kind of a closed market. So there's this interest in expanding overseas, but non-Americans have not proved as interested in this as Americans are. Europeans are often of the mind that they know where they're from. They know they're from here, right? Wherever the here is, and they know who they are. And so there's not this kind of spirit of genealogical inquiry of like, where was my grandfather from again? Because they're often it's more homogenous potentially, depending on where you are, and it might be more kind of intergenerational staying in the same place. So, this question of where are we going is a good one. I think that Ancestry, which has doubled down on DNA testing for family history research, is going to have to figure that out. And 23andMe, which is the other biggest player in this space, has focused on the lucrativeness of the health market. So they're, of the 4 companies I mentioned, they're the ones that are most known for returning health-related results. About your risk of, potentially developing a certain kind of breast cancer, that kind of thing. They have a kind of a famous backstory of how they feuded with the FDA, and the FDA shut them down from offering health results. And then when they were finally able to give certain types of results, and it's this kind of fascinating Silicon Valley story. But they've kind of decided that the future of this is in medicine and in drug development and in health-related testing, and the kind of power of having millions of people who've spit into a vial, paid to have their results analyzed, and then consented to answer questions about their results and about their health history. And when the company kind of puts together all that DNA information combined with all that self-reported information, they have an enormous amount of data with which to solve health problems and also potentially make money, right? That's a big part of it. And so it's going to be interesting to see where the industry goes, right? Whether 23andMe is right. A lot of people feel that they are, that the health market is much more money in it. And, whether they're actually able to come up with drugs that solve, certain kinds of cancers, which is what they've been researching most recently. Will they be able to do that? And will they sort of turbocharge medicine, which is what they promised to be able to do.
Very good. Thank you so much. You've been very, very interesting. I learned a lot. And
you'll be taking a DNA test, or you'll definitely be not taking a DNA test?
I'm not sure if I remember that, but I probably closer to getting a test than I did before I saw the presentation here. This is very interesting. My family is big, and it would be interesting, I guess, to learn a little bit more. Libby Copeland, the name of her book is The Lost Family, and obviously it's a lot about DNA and DNA testing. Thanks so much, Libby.
Thank you so much. It was really fun. All right, have a good one.